Okay, let's move on and finish this lecture off by talking about the actual processes to measure the content of what we discussed last week, assessment procedures themselves. Let's start off by looking at this table. This table illustrates a number of different assessments that we typically use in IO psychology, as well as some of the other criteria that is out there to, well as some of the criteria that's out there to evaluate the test, such as whether the test is valid, whether the tests are perceived fairly, and the cost. The second criterion, adverse impact, is a bit more technical and refers to the extent to which the test results in differential selection of subgroups. In other words, is a selection of minority group members, whether it is females, African Americans or Hispanics, is a selection of minority groups less than 4/5 of the majority group. If so, it leads to something that is negative called adverse impact, or at least negatively perceived by most legal systems. But take a look at all these different areas. We have cognitive ability tests, we have physical ability tests, we have assessment centers, which we've talked about briefly, we have interviews, we have work samples, and finally we have personality tests. Let's begin by taking a look at cognitive ability tests. Cognitive ability tests are simply a test or collection of tests that allow us to assess whether a candidate can demonstrate what he or she knows, perceives, remembers, or can work with. The validity is pretty good. So it does predict job success or job performance pretty well. Does it lead to adverse impact or that differential selection of subgroups? Unfortunately, yes. Minorities tend to score about 0.5 to 1 standard deviation lower, but we do see that number is getting smaller and smaller over time, which is good. Do applicants perceive this test as fair? Yes, but of course not all groups. In terms of cost, they can be very cheap, but they are also very intensely time-consuming, so it can be expensive to develop. Physical ability tests are tests that assess the candidate's static strength, explosive strength, coordination, stamina. In terms of validity, they're strong, but only for appropriate jobs. So they're not going to be a good test to use for, say, a secretary, but they would be a good test to use for, say, a police officer. Do they lead to adverse impact? Yes, unfortunately, they do. Oftentimes, they lead to the differential selection of women and of older candidates. They tend to score lower. Are they perceived fairly? Yes, but not by all groups. And as you can guess, sometimes not by the groups that don't get chosen for particular jobs. In terms of cost, they also can be difficult and costly to develop, administer, and evaluate. Medical and drug testing also, one quick note, I just want you to know that with medical and drug testing, these are things that you can do, but they have to occur after you've given a conditional offer of employment. You can't ask someone to take a drug test before you offer them employment. This is an example of a physical ability test. It's the Crawford Small Parts Dexterity Test. And basically what you do is you put these little pins inside each of the holes, and then there is a little thing that you put on top of it, and then another thing that you put on top, and you have to go through this and do each single little one. And this is the kind of thing that we might want, say, a surgeon to be able to do well, because it gets at your fine dexterity skills. Personality tests. We've talked about the construct of personality, but these are just tests that assess the candidate's personality traits, keeping in mind that in IO psychology we focus on normal personality. So we're not going to be looking at whether or not people are narcissistic or whether or not they're schizophrenic, etc. in the workplace. In terms of validity, they have moderately strong validity, and they do really well with jobs that require high level of interpersonal skills, such as those jobs that but those jobs that see a lot of people that have the ability to demonstrate what we call organizational citizenship behaviors, or OCBs, but also counterproductive work behaviors, or CWBs, included in job performance that we're trying to predict. Do they lead to adverse impact? Luckily for us, they do not, which is really good. Do people perceive them as fair? Unfortunately, they do not, and that's usually because people don't understand what's being measured when they take a personality test, and they have a difficult time understanding the relationship between a personality test and their jobs. In terms of cost, they are generally cheap to administer. An individual assessment is a situation in which only one candidate at a time or a very small group is assessed on many different attributes. With these kinds of assessments, you can create candidate profiles. They're typically only used for executive positions or CEO or very top level positions, and they're extremely expensive to develop. Okay, we've talked about assessment centers before. Assessment centers are, again, a collection of procedures used to evaluate a candidate's knowledge, skills, and abilities for a particular job. They're administered to groups instead of individuals, and they tend to simulate real experience. In terms of validity, they're very strong, especially for complex jobs. As a consultant, I've done a lot of work with assessment centers, and we've used them in the Houston area and in Louisiana for assessing individuals for the position of operators in refineries. And they do very well in those particular positions. Do they lead to adverse impact? Again, this is very positive. They do not lead to differential selection of subgroups, so no, they don't. In terms of fairness, they are mostly perceived as fair, but again, some of the aspects, for example, if you stick a personality test in there, are not perceived as fair by all groups. In terms of costs, these are extremely expensive to develop, administer, and score. You have to have a lot of people involved. So some features of an assessment center are that multiple candidates are assessed in small groups, usually of less than 12 people. You usually will have multiple assessors. When I was working on assessment centers, we would have groups of at least 3 or 4 of us who were evaluating candidates. You use multiple methods of assessment, as I said, and oftentimes this might involve paper and pencil tests, interviews, work samples or in baskets, as well as group exercises. They often have face validity. So when people use or participate, in these particular assessments, candidates believe that this is relevant to their job, and they believe that what they're being tested on is important and related to what they will be doing eventually. Okay, so everyone knows what employment interviews are, right, gang? Well, in IO psychology, we've spent a lot of time researching the effects of interviews, and we look at them in a bit more of a technical way. So interviews are simply defined as a method used to gather information about job applicants to predict future work behavior. Interviews differ according to whether we ask questions that elicit past versus future, as well as how structured the interview is. And they're wonderful because they can be designed to assess many different attributes. The technical part is the structure aspect, and I'll talk more about this in a second. But first, situational interviews ask candidates to describe how they would respond in a hypothetical situation. And they're based on the assumption that intentions predict behavior. Their validity is strong. 0.46 is actually pretty strong. But they don't do as well in very high complex jobs, but they're pretty strong. An example of a situational interview question might be the following. Suppose you were giving a presentation and a difficult question arose that you couldn't answer. What would you do? That's an example of a situational interview question. Past behavior questions ask applicants to describe how they did actually behave in a situation, and they're based on the assumption, as you might guess, that past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior, and their validity again is also strong, approximately 0.57. An example of a past behavior interview question is, based on your previous work experience, what is the most significant action you have taken to help a coworker? Now, structure, as I just said, involves a bit more technical definition. According to some of the most famous researchers in the area of interviewing, one of which is here in the IO program here at U of H, Dr. Jim Campion, structure in an interview is any enhancement of an interview that is designed to increase psychometric properties, that is, reliability and validity, by increasing standardization or otherwise assisting the interviewer in determining, and look in bold, and this is what's important, in determining what questions to ask and how to evaluate responses. So structure to an interview is changing things about what questions will be asked and how to evaluate those responses. And again, by psychometric properties, we're talking about enhancing reliability and validity. So there's lots of things that we can do to enhance structure. For example, on the side of adding structure to what questions we ask, we can conduct a job analysis to determine what is important on the job and what knowledge, skills, and abilities and other traits you need to develop questions for the interview. Another way of adding structure is to ask the same questions of each applicant. Another way is to limit an interview's probing of the candidates. And finally, another way to add structure to the content of an interview is to not allow candidates to ask questions. What effects do these additions of structure add to an interview? Well, in terms of reliability, the asking the same questions, limiting probing, and no questions from candidates actually make interviews predict even better and increase their reliability. In terms of validity, adding a job analysis, asking the same questions of each of the applicants, and limiting their probing increases validity. Now, in terms of the job analysis, that also enhances applicants' reactions to the interview. Unfortunately, limiting the number of questions that an applicant can ask and also limiting the amount of probing that an interviewer can do in an interview is negatively perceived by applicants. And then finally, conducting a job analysis, asking the same questions, and then offering only limiting probing, leads to reduced bias as well as litigation, which is good. We can also add structure to the evaluation of interviews in another way. So one thing we can do is we can use anchored rating systems where interviewers know and are trained on what a rating of 5 might mean, a 4 might mean, a 3, and so on. And having the interviewers take detailed notes is another way of adding structure to the evaluation of the interview. Having multiple interviewers is yet another way of adding structure. Finally, providing the interviewers, which would seem like a no-brainer, don't you think, gang, with training is another way of adding structure to the evaluation of an interview. What effects do these structural changes have? Well, all of these have positive, meaning beneficial effects on reliability, validity, and employment litigation. On the other hand, research shows us that applicants don't respond too well to multiple interviewers, which makes sense. An interviewer is nerve-wracking enough, right, without having to be interviewed in front of multiple people, right? And then applicants also respond well to interviewers who are trained, which would also make sense. What affects interviewer ratings themselves? Well, let's take a look at some things. Well, one thing is whether or not the interviewer and applicant are similar in terms of physical characteristics and other personality characteristics. If they are, then applicants tend to be rated more favorably. Verbal and nonverbal cues can also influence interviewer ratings. Applicant attractiveness. I guess you can probably figure out this one. The more attractive an applicant is, the more likely they are to be rated favorably. And finally, applicant training and interview techniques. If you've been trained in interview techniques, you're going to be rated higher. So obviously has some practical applications for you guys. Try to get some training before you go to your job interviews. Some parting thoughts about interviews. Structured interviews, they assess knowledge, skills, and abilities. They have higher validity coefficients than unstructured interviews, so obviously structure is important. But they often result in more negative reactions from applicants themselves. Their validity is strong. They sometimes lead to adverse impact, and it's out for debate still, but yes, it does sometimes lead to differential selection. In terms of fairness, there's less positive reactions for structured interviews from applicants, but the courts really prefer structure, so that's important. In terms of cost, they're expensive if you're designing a structured interview, and if you're going to conduct a job analysis, train interviews, and go through all of that, they can be expensive. Well, we'll post a couple of videos for you to see some humorous examples of things not to do in an interview, okay? I'll forewarn you that the naughty one is one that some of you may find offensive, but the kind of raunchy humor that I love, I'm sorry. Another assessment that we use is work sample tests. These are basically asking candidates to essentially perform the job and then evaluate them doing that. Obviously, there are benefits to seeing if an applicant can actually do what we want them to do already and prove it, right? So examples might be having pilots do a rudder control test or to ask a foreign exchange student to talk in an interview and demonstrate their understanding of the English language. Another type of assessment is what we call a situational judgment test. This is where you present candidates or applicants with written scenarios and then ask the candidates to choose the best response from a series of alternatives. Some important characteristics to know about situational judgment tests is that they're highly related to the job, they are often well accepted by applicants, and they reduce adverse impact compared to other devices, so they're great. And finally, we use biographical data at times, and we call this biodata. This is asking questions about previous jobs, education, and special training. Sometimes we even ask more strange questions, or at least applicants think that they're strange questions. So you have to be careful about this, but they do predict job performance, and that's why we do them. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our lecture on the assessment of individual differences, and this concludes our discussion on Chapter 3. Enjoy. Take care. Bye-bye.